One day my father-in-law said to me, pointed to a fine Breguet watch he had, very simple watch, and he said, how much would it cost to make a watch like that today? And I said, well, I've no idea because it couldn't be done today. And I went home and I thought about it, and I thought, why can't it be done today? Why? I didn't see any reason why it can't be done. I think I'll do it. I think I'll start making watches. And then the more I thought about this, the more intrigued I became with the idea, because it suddenly occurred to me that all the work I'd done on restoration in other people's watches was lost. The name of Daniels would not be heard of. What we needed were some watches with Daniels, London, on them.
George Daniels is a technologist of time, an Englishman whose talents are so remarkable that there's an international waiting list for his work. He's the only man in the world who not only constructs a watch to his own original design, but makes all the components that go into it. He takes at least a year to produce a single watch, making every wheel and pivot, even the tiniest screw. The result is a masterpiece of horology, a combination of craftsmanship, art and science.
There are a great many people who would like to buy these watches, you know, but it's become quite plain. They really want to buy them as investments, you see. Now, I learned this very convincingly when I sold a watch some years ago to an American. And when I saw him 3 years later, I asked him how his watch was going. Well, gee, he said, I don't exactly know, because it's been in a bank vault ever since I had it. Well, that's not much good, you see. It's no good making watches for people who put them in bank vaults.
Clocks and watches have intrigued him since he was 5. That's when he began taking clocks apart, but he put them back again in working order. Other boys read adventure stories. His heroes were the great clockmakers of the past. At school, he earned his pocket money repairing teachers' watches, money that was badly needed.
You see, we lived in very poor circumstances. My father was a carpenter. He got drunk whenever he could, and so, of course, he tended to use up more of his share of the money than he should. And so we, on the whole, had insufficient food, an insufficient variety of food. And I can remember quite often having to wear, for instance, my sister's cast-off shoes, because there were none to be bought for me. I frequently had holes in my trousers. Sometimes I didn't have any trousers. But we lived the sort of life that you don't really, I think, find today.
George Daniels is 50. He lives in a South London suburb with his wife and 11-year-old daughter, the only person in the world who knows nothing about horology but who owns a Daniels watch. Her childhood is sharply different from his own. He left school at 14 and was put to work in a mattress factory, clipping springs together. He joined the army as a clerical orderly and continued repairing watches in his spare time. When he came out, he spent his gratuity on watchmaking tools, but the only job he could find was working in a shop for £3 a week. Luckily, his early life had given him some useful lessons.
When I was a boy, it was very fashionable once a year to have Empire Day. Everybody walked about waving Union Jacks. I didn't have a Union Jack, they were tuppence or something, you know, and I felt rather out of it. Suddenly I spied a flag with a broken stick lying on the pavement, so I picked it up, waved it, and I thought I'm beginning to look like these other chaps now, and I suddenly realized I didn't want to look like them. I had my own thoughts and philosophy for so long, I preferred it. And I suppose you might say that the deprivation we suffered and the spirit you had to engender to rise above it was a firm grounding for a thoroughgoing, independent arrogance that I found most helpful in later life, more especially since I've discovered that if you're a professional at anything, there has to be some arrogance and some independence. Otherwise, you won't stand apart from other professionals.
Daniels eventually became a professional watch repairer and then spent 10 years restoring antique clocks and watches, a chance to learn how the masters had gone about their craft. At last it was time to tackle the first Daniels watch.
I thought some 6 or 7 years ago that the scene was rather desolate. The wonderful traditions of the past, the inventiveness, the ingenuity, the supreme craftsmanship of the individual, all seemed to have gone. By the 30s, the last few surviving men were either retiring or had died, and the scene seemed to me to be pretty dead. What a pity, I thought, that so many wonderful traditions, especially in the field that I was interested in, should have vanished. My plan was simply, if possible, to regenerate interest in a handmade watch. There's always this quaint image that the public seem to have about the watchmaker sitting in a quiet, dusty corner of the room, working by the shade of an oil lamp with a green eye shade. But it's not a bit like that here. In order to avoid the sheer physical labor of making these components, I use machinery. This can save me a tremendous amount of work, and in fact my machines represent the actual manual labor of the bench worker in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the hand methods I use, it takes me some 2,500 hours to make a good precision watch. And in fact, the last one took 3,500 hours. It's vitally important that a jewel should fit accurately into its hole. And there mustn't be more than a difference of 1/100th of a millimetre between the diameter of the jewel and the diameter of the hole. And so you can see I have to work to very fine limits, and it can be very exacting work. I'm very fond of music, and especially the opera, for which I have, I suppose one might say, a passion. And I get tremendous satisfaction from some of the older records. Gary Kirchie is a great favourite of mine, and I suppose I'm particularly fond of her, not only because she sings so beautifully, but she was self-taught, and so am I. I feel there's some sort of affinity between us. They used to call her the Italian Nightingale, and my own feeling is that nothing nearer to the sound of a nightingale could be imagined than Gary Kirchie in full flight. I've been interested in music since I was about 14 years of age. I couldn't afford a gramophone and there was no way of acquiring one, and I managed to build myself one from pieces of cardboard and wood, and it was necessary to turn the turntable by hand with a finger in the middle of the record, and the pickup was nothing more than a cardboard cone with an ordinary sewing needle wedged in the end. But it managed to convey to me the impression of the music, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The first moment of obvious progress in the construction of a watch is the initial assembly of the basic components that have been manufactured over 2 or 3 months and placed in a box, in which, of course, I don't see them until I come to this particular day, which is one of the more exciting days in the construction, and I can now begin to see the shape and style of the watch and just hope that it's resembling precisely what I had in mind when I started.
George Daniels is a freeman of the City of London. The document granting him the honour describes him simply as clockmaker and citizen of London. No grand title could please him more. He belongs to the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers and is closely involved with its museum, part of the new Guildhall Library.
Then I wanted to talk to you about this.
This is the oldest collection in the world devoted solely to horology, containing examples of all its important inventions, most of which, as Daniels is always glad to point out, were British. In the 18th and 19th centuries, London dominated the science of horology throughout the world. George Daniels knows every item in the collection, from its precision chronometers to its brilliant curiosities.
Here are some of our earliest watches, these dating from the early 17th century, and they're not always recognizable as watches. Here, for example, is a beautiful watch in the form of a silver skull, engraved with religious scenes. And to discover the time, we open the jaw to reveal the dial, and to wind it, hinge out the movement. This watch is said to have belonged to Mary Queen of Scots. And here again is another example of an early 17th century watch, this one in the form of a dove, although quite often they represented lions or dogs. And the object of making a case in this fashion was simply to distract the owner's attention from the vagaries of the timekeeping of the watch. Such watches were incapable of keeping time to within half an hour a day, and by making them in this form, they offered a greater attraction to the purchaser. The dials are made from sheet silver and marked off into the various circles, sectors and seconds parts that the dial might require. The whole process of making a dial can take 2 or sometimes 3 days, and most of the work is taken up in engine turning, which is a rather tedious business. It can't be hurried, it must be done most carefully, and of course the smallest mistake and the dial is ruined, because you cannot rectify mistakes. Curiously, one of the very interesting aspects of watchmaking is the making of the hands, because here of course one has tremendous scope for shape and style. Once the hand is roughly to shape, I can then try it on the dial and decide just where I'm going to alter its shape, or perhaps make it a little more slender or curve the edges. And this process may be repeated some 30 or 40 times before the hand is finally completed to the precise style that I require for a particular dial. The escapement controls the timekeeping of the watch. When one winds the watch, of course, the mainspring contains every bit of power you can put into it, and if it weren't for the escapement, it would all unwind with a sudden explosion, which wouldn't produce very good timekeeping results. And so what one must do is control the speed of unwinding of the mainspring, and this the escapement does by releasing tiny units of power from the spring at every tick of the watch. The escapement contains, of course, the most delicate components in the watch, and to me is the most interesting part to make, for it is in the escapement that one can exercise one's imagination with a view to improving the quality of timekeeping. It might be thought that after 150 to 200 years of development of an escapement that it could not be taken any further, but this is not so. It can be taken further, it can be improved. And I know I have improved it in my workshop, and I have ideas for making further improvements, which I think will establish in the end the superiority of the mechanical watch over the electronic watch. It's always a tremendously satisfying moment when you wind the watch for the first time. After some 9 or 10 months of creative endeavour, you suddenly see your work come to life. Although in horology I prefer small watches to large clocks, in the question of motor cars, I seem to go the other way. I suppose it is that large engines revolve more slowly than small engines, and one has time to see mechanical commotion occurring. I suppose the link between motor cars, motor bicycles and watches is simply my love of mechanics.
In the garage below his workshop, he restores old cars and motorcycles with the perfectionism that runs through all his work. Wrecks bound for the dumping yard end up winning vintage car rallies with Daniels at the wheel.
I met my wife in the house of a client. He'd invited me down and to discuss his fine collection of watches, and a very pretty girl came in and served dinner, and I noticed when we were about to start the meal she came and sat with us, and I afterwards discovered it was his daughter. Well, I thought I must do something about this, and eventually we married. My wife was brought up in a quite well-to-do family, private schools, finishing school in Switzerland, and all that sort of thing. Typical Isha, upper middle class family. The vintage Bentley is my favourite vintage car. Everything about it reflects the simple, honest integrity of W.O. Bentley, for whom I have the greatest admiration. And indeed, his portrait hangs on the wall in my workshop so that he can keep an eye on me and see that I don't deviate from the true paths of mechanical progress while I'm working. Working in precious metals, as I do when making cases, requires quite different techniques to those used in making the works of the watch. And one naturally develops a kind of style, and mine essentially is to cover the works with the absolute minimum amount of box to give it a purely functional appearance. And then one feels, as the case begins to take shape, that one is, as it were, sculpting in precious metals and achieving the style that one envisaged at the beginning but can't make plans for on paper.
Once a week, George Daniels heads for Bond Street, where he acts as a consultant to Sotheby's, a congenial source of income. Although a Daniels watch costs at least £10,000, producing one can take 2 years of his life. No way to make a quick fortune. Easy riches could be had if he cared to turn out reproduction clocks, but this he rejects as a sterile way of spending his time. His day at Sotheby's provides a break from watchmaking and keeps him in contact with the works of his predecessors.
Good, that's an excellent and recognisable tune, and a handsome watch, which we can include in our Zurich sale. I just want to check the date. You've got 1810, excellent, and I would suggest a price of £1,200.
More.
More?
Yes.
Would you like more? Well, as it's Zurich, I think we might say 12 to 1500.
Yeah, fine.
Excellent. Now, could you get me that Breguet self-winder from the safe, please? I meant to check and see if it had a stop device for the winding weight. Thank you. Looks more handsome every time you see it, doesn't it? Oh, yes, it has got a stop lever. Very early. A repeater, self-winding. Clatting away, oscillating inside. Good. Well, now, we must complete a more detailed description of this lady. We can make a brief note on it. That it's 1791, Breguet, self-winding, and I think we'll consider a price of £25,000 to £30,000. Good. Excellent. Now, let's have a look at the Moses watch. I've been thinking about this, the catalogue description, and I think there's no question that it's a very handsome thing, and as it's so rare, we can describe it as fine and rare. We'll give a full description of the automaton, which is Moses striking the rock to produce water for the children of Israel. We'll just give that a run through. There he is. Now he's striking the rock, you see, raising both arms. And this little chap down here drinking the water. Quite a remarkable piece of horology, isn't it? And then if you pull this lever here, you see, you get the repeating mechanism at the bottom and the putty striking the bells. So then we'll describe it as fine and rare. This is just a brief description and we'll fill it in later. And it's a cylinder escapement, a movement, and the repetition is visible on the back plate. We'll describe the multicoloured gold dial with the white enamel chapter ring. We'll see that in detail later. The name, Fleury Lane. I believe I've seen one of these once before, and I believe that had the same signature on it. So we'll complete that description later on. And I think, you know, I've given it some consideration. I reckon that's going to fetch 20 to 30,000 pounds. Well, I think so. It's a very rare thing. This put at 20 to 30,000. I spend most of my time in the workshop. When I'm making a watch, perhaps 10 or 12 hours a day. I don't like stopping work. When you're working on small, delicate mechanisms with fine tools, you know, the tools somehow tend to grow cold when you put them down. I think my watches are quite original in appearance, and certainly they are in the style of their construction. I try to embody new principles, mechanical principles, to improve their timekeeping. And I want each one of my watches to advance the science of horology as well as to be an original work of art.
And after the time signal for 8 o'clock, we shall have the news, which is read for us this morning by Susan Denny.
The finished watch is tested for 4 months. It must keep time to within half a second a day, and mustn't vary in its accuracy by more than 1/10 of a second a day. It must stay accurate in all temperatures, so he heats it in an oven to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Even in the Antarctic, a Daniels watch will never let its owner down.
I would expect one of my watches to give reliable service without any attention for 20 years. And provided it will service once every 20 years, I would expect it to go for 300 or 400 years. There's nothing new in this. You know, good watches have been going for 400 years, and they still go today. A good watch, properly serviced, will go indefinitely. Mind you, if you care to buy one and it doesn't go for 400 years, you can't have your money back.
Daniels has written several scholarly books, producing the drawings as well as the words. But early on, when he needed the illustrations for his work on the great horologist Breguet, he had no experience as a draftsman.
And so I spoke to a young man I knew who was trained and skilled, and I asked him what he thought he could do to help me in this, and he seemed to think he'd have no difficulty making these drawings. And we discussed the price, and for quite a simple drawing it was going to be £30, and I thought, well, he's not going to have any difficulty making the drawings, but I'm going to have quite a bit of difficulty paying for them. So I had to go away and rethink it, you see, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to do these drawings myself. There's no way around it. I certainly can't afford that. I wanted something like 150 drawings, and so I started again at the drawing board, and after a half a dozen drawings, I began to feel quite confident about it and was moving the drawing instruments about like a professional, you see, and I began to enjoy myself. And I think it does go to show that when your back's against the wall, well, the thing is to buckle to and learn a new technique and get on with it.
His latest work is to be a practical handbook on watchmaking, the first of its kind to be written for over 60 years, and aimed at those he hopes will follow his own path.
I'm not really self-satisfied about being the only watchmaker in the world who is doing this work. I think it's a pity that others don't take it up. Having myself discovered how very simple it can be to make a watch, it seems a pity that not to teach some others to do the same thing. Not the least reason being that when you consider the state of the economics of our country in the present moment, you see, we find that men who work in factories don't care for working in factories. It's not the British way of life to be regimented into a mundane routine task all the time. The British have an expansive philosophy, and they're capable of reaching a horizon if it's shown to them. I would like, in a small way, to make some contribution towards teaching these people to use the natural talents that are in their fingers and which at the present moment are just lying fallow and doing nothing. With this in mind, I've been thinking lately of starting a school of horology in London, where certain selected pupils could learn every aspect of the art of horology and in the end set themselves up as watchmakers. I was talking in Switzerland to some members of the Swiss watch manufacturing industry, and we were discussing my ambition to teach other people, and their response immediately was, well, why don't you come and live here and do it? I say, well, that was very nice, and I'm sure I'd enjoy it very much, especially my wife who loves to ski. But I'm English, and I'm nationalist, and I like to live here in England. And it would be much more pleasing to me to see Englishmen producing handmade watches than to have it done in any other country. After all, London was the birthplace of precision horology, and I would like to see it re-established here again. I think the work I've done in the last 8 to 10 years has made a beginning. It's my final ambition in horology to see it absolutely re-established in London. London, the home of the handmade watch.